Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Recovery Talk. So in this episode, we are going to talk about relapse. Why do people relapse? And I think by being aware of some of these things I'm going to discuss in this episode, I hope that maybe can at least make you a little bit more aware of some of the potential pitfalls. And I want to talk a bit about some of the themes that I've seen over many years of doing this work. So yeah, let's get into it. Or actually, let's not get into it. I have a very quick announcement that I think hopefully some of you guys will appreciate. And that is that I'm officially back on Substack at letsrecover.substack.com. So if you want to read recovery articles and recovery articles that are written by a human being and not AI, then head over there. It's completely free to follow. If you subscribe, you will get just article sent to your email now and then. I'm probably never going to be someone who sends you a daily recovery article. I'm, again, like I said, human. I like to put some time and thought into the work that I'm doing. I actually don't even know if people care anymore, if an article or a YouTube video or a podcast is all just AI scripted, but I really care about that. And I hope that there are some people who still appreciate slightly imperfect human writing. But hey, if you do, you know where to go. Enough about that. You know, I like to jump into topics without too much of a waffle beforehand. So let's talk about relapse, guys. So I think a lot of times when talking about relapse, people focus on the external factors and situations. For example, something happened. The person felt really triggered. And of course, that's true. If someone is going through a life transition, maybe someone has just had a baby, or they have just lost someone they care about, or they are moving across the country. Of course, we know that those are things where there is a slightly elevated relapse risk. But people often don't talk about some of the potential reasons why that may be, except for the fact that, it's triggering. Okay, but why could that be triggering? Because let's face it, most of us will at some point in the year or the years after recovering experience some kind of triggering event or transition. But not everyone relapses. And why is that? And I'm going to say something that may sound a bit controversial, but I sometimes find that when there is a very big thing happening in someone's life, they may be a bit more aware that, wow, this could be a potential trigger, and therefore they're being a bit extra careful in terms of their recovery, which can then actually make them safer and less likely to relapse. Imagine, for example, someone is going through a breakup and they're feeling really triggered. There might be appetite loss, and I'll get back to that a bit, how that can be a relapse trigger just a bit later in this episode. But yeah, they maybe go through that potentially triggering time, but they're very aware that, okay, I know that this is a triggering time. I heard that repeated to me in therapy, that losing someone can be a trigger. So I'm going to get all my recovery tools together, maybe seek out some extra support, and I will get through this. But what I often see is that a lot of relapses happen when the person doesn't know that they are in a relapse risk situation. In the same way, someone going through, for example, a breakup may notice that the eating disorder is quite loudly screaming at them if they're vulnerable. But if someone is in that more subtle situation where it's not really that the eating disorder is screaming, and they're not necessarily trying to restrict or lose weight, but their appetite just hasn't been the same. And do I really even need all of these recovery things anymore? That gray zone is where a lot of relapses may happen, and then eventually becomes a very slippery slope. And someone may suddenly then find themselves with a very screaming eating disorder and wonder, how did I get here? So I can come with some random examples of what I spoke about. Maybe someone has had some health issues and maybe they've had to make some dietary changes. They work with a dietitian, maybe excluding, let's say, gluten and dairy, thinking that may help some of their physical symptoms. which it often don't, by the way, but let's just use it as an example. And this may not come from the eating disorder. They may genuinely be feeling really unwell and hope that this may help them. So it's like, yeah, I'm cutting out foods, but it's for the quote unquote right reasons. And then they start noticing something creeping up, but they're not in relapse. They're doing this for health reasons. So why is something coming up? And because there's a slight denial and a slight almost black and white thinking, like either it is the eating disorder or it isn't, people may not be as quick and proactive with reaching out for support or preparing themselves or maybe using some old recovery tools compared to if they were in a situation that they knew very well could be a trigger. There are so many examples of these situations that I'm not saying nobody knows these can be triggers for eating disorder, recovery, relapse. I think any dietitian who works with eating disorders will be very clear that elimination diets, for example, is a massive potential trigger for eating disorder relapse. But I'm talking more about the person's intentions and internal feelings when they start to make that change. So this is one of those situations, just very specific situations that I see often can lead to relapse, and that is dietary changes or restrictions, even if they do not come from the eating disorder. Veganism can be another example here. And although a lot of people gravitate towards veganism for eating disorder reasons, I do believe that there are some people who will fully recover, feel really good, and then be like, now I really want to try out veganism. And even if it comes from the best of intentions, it can still start leading to something creeping back. That feeling of going into a grocery store and a kind of a large portion of the grocery store being just a no-go zone, or going out to eat with friends and sitting there and being the person not eating. Even if it's not done with the intention of I'm going to lose weight and control my food, it still can bring something back. And I know it also can be really tricky if someone genuinely has to make a specific dietary change for health reasons. For example, someone diagnosed with diabetes or celiac disease. And in those two latter situations, of course, we can't then say, oh, just ignore your illness, because that also comes with consequences. But I also don't think we should completely ignore the eating disorder either, which is why it's so important to work with someone who can understand those nuances and ideally have a treatment team where they can cater to both. Because a lot of times it's that thing of, well, you had an eating disorder in the past and now you're diagnosed with celiac disease. Well, you don't have an eating disorder now, so we're not even going to consider that past and how having a food restriction imposed on you may be something that could risk certain things coming back. And if you're not prepared for it, then how can you work with if those things come forward, right? And I think this can be especially challenging for people who have a lot of identity into being recovered, where what can sometimes happen, they notice certain thoughts coming back, but they're like, no, I don't have those thoughts anymore. What the heck? That can't be the eating disorder, so it must be something else. Another example is pregnancy and the postpartum period, especially breastfeeding. A lot of people talk about pregnancy as a potential, trigger because your body is changing. Your hunger is going to go above its usual baseline, as it should. You're growing a baby. But there's not always the same amount of talk about the postpartum period. And I've actually seen this for quite a lot of people being a very triggering period, sometimes even more triggering than pregnancy. Your body has gone through a lot. You may be looking at your postpartum body and be like, oh, I look different. And then there is a very, very important thing. And this is something that counts for all of the other points I've made. So postpartum period, food restrictions, whether ethical or medical, even things like move or loss. And that is a period of time where you, for whatever reason, end up in an energetic deficit. And this is what people don't always understand. They think that the energetic deficit is something that has to be conscious and has to be imposed by the pre-existing thoughts. So people think of relapse as, I'm going through a breakup, I'm sad, I want to lose weight, so I start eating less. And don't get me wrong, that is It's definitely something that can happen. That's many people's experience. But I often see something slightly different, which is that someone maybe go through, for example, a breakup, and then their appetite drops, and then they may lose a little bit of weight, and then something starts shifting a little bit in their brain. So think about, for example, the postpartum period. Yes, you may look at your body in the mirror and say, wow, I look different than I did before the pregnancy. And yeah, that can make someone then be like, I need to lose the weight. But a lot of times what happens is that someone is postpartum, they may be breastfeeding, and their energy needs are incredibly high, sometimes a little bit too high to a point where it's hard not to fall into an energetic deficit. And of course, being postpartum, it's common to lose weight. That's quite normal, just like you gain weight in pregnancy to a bit above where your weight may naturally be, you will also then lose that weight. It's almost a bit like similar to overshot, right? But if this happens fast, and if this happens with a deficit that may be a little bit bigger than it should, even if it's not intentional, this can still be a trigger. And again, exactly the same with any kind of food limitations. Maybe you got diagnosed with celiac disease, and suddenly a lot of the foods that you would kind of just grab on the go, you can't have anymore. It becomes logistically harder to make sure you're getting enough food. Or maybe you're a vegan and you're eating the Oreos, you're, fueling yourself, but you still notice that it's quite inconvenient in day-to-day life because society isn't built for veganism. And same thing with various health conditions, especially gut conditions. IBS is a good example. Suddenly you're excluding foods, and it makes it harder to, have the same habits that you usually had, same freedom you usually had. And you may notice that you're sitting there hungry when other people are eating. Not because you want to lose weight, but because the food that they're eating has an ingredient you can't have. So again, it's the unintentional energetic deficit that I so often see send someone into a relapse. It's not the only reason, of course. It's just one of those reasons that happen that often isn't spoken about. Because the relapse often isn't intentional, and because the thought and desire to lose weight and control your food in like a eating disorder way may not happen until you're in the deficit. This may not be the driving factor for the behavior initially. So it's being missed, often by yourself, sometimes by other people, sometimes even by your treatment professionals. So yeah, this was one potential relapse factor or reason that I often see. And another one that I want to talk about is, I'm fine now, so I'll just lose a little bit of weight. It'll be different this time. So the most common group that I see here is someone who they're at a weight that the body is happy with. They don't have any negative health consequences due to their weight. They just have a part of them that wish they were a bit smaller, and they don't really see the harm. What if they just eat a little bit less and exercise a little bit more for a while, and then they'll feel better, and then they'll stop. They won't go back to the eating disorder this time. And then there is another group, which is someone who's in a bigger body, and they're wondering if maybe losing weight could have positive health consequences for me. And sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. I do tend to think that we overstate the impact of weight and understate all the other things that play into health. But I will also acknowledge that there are people who lose weight and then they have, better blood pressure management, better blood sugar management, lower cholesterol levels. But also those things aren't exclusively tied to weight either. So I think it's important to take a health at every size approach here. But this particular group may sometimes think that, well, it has nothing to do with me wanting to be skinny. I'm doing this for my health. Therefore, it can never be a trigger. It can never be something that make me relapse. Some people may be quite aware that this could potentially be triggering, but some people may be like, no, I'm over this whole eating disorder thing. I'm on a health journey, so there's no way this is going to trigger me. But sometimes it can, and it's okay to admit that, especially if it's very attached to weight rather than engaging in health-promoting behavior. But remember as well that what is a health-promoting behavior for one person may be a not health-promoting behavior for another person. And I tend to see a pattern with people with eating disorders where they will kind of self-diagnose with a lot of health issues that are more tied to things like metabolic syndrome, and then start applying a lot of strategies that are not really going to meaningfully improve their health. Maybe they read something about cortisol and blood sugar online, so they start adding a bunch of Greek yogurt every time they eat cake. Yeah, this may be a helpful thing for someone who has type 2 diabetes, but is it going to be helpful for a person whose body is actually regulating blood sugar normally? Probably not. If anything, it may just reinforce stress around food. Are you sure you have cortisol face or cortisol belly or whatever it is? Or do you have body dysmorphia? And if there's anything that increases stress and cortisol, it's obsessing about your body and obsessing about food. So if you are someone who genuinely have a health reason to make changes to your food and eating, not just self-imposed and imagined, not health issues that aren't really related to that, but you make it be. For example, some people have genetically high cholesterol. Some people may experience their blood sugar being kind of funny when they're in recovery. Not talking about that. I'm talking about someone who maybe just have gotten a type 2 diabetes diagnosis and are going to start working with a dietitian. Maybe you find that it all goes well, but it is okay to disclose that, hey, I've had an eating disorder in the past. I'm in a pretty good place, but I just want to make sure to be a bit mindful of too much discussion about my weight and too much framing of food as good or bad. There are so many amazing dietitians out there who work in that intersection between various health conditions and things and situations that require some degree of changes to someone's dietary patterns and eating disorders and disordered eating. And then just back a bit to the other thing I mentioned, which is someone who may be completely healthy, but they're just like, I just want to lose weight. I think my body looks better when it's thinner. Maybe they consider themselves fully recovered. Maybe they aren't quite there. Because I would say if you have a very intense desire to lose weight, it can maybe be argued is that desire the eating disorder. And some people may feel this desire, be able to acknowledge that, no, that is a disordered part of me that wants this. I can have that desire, but I'll still just go on with my life. I'm not going to take it out on my food, on my exercise, on how I relate to my body. I'm going to accept the little ghost thought and not give in to it. And that's typically how I would work with clients, to just kind of sometimes let thoughts be, like don't latch onto them so much. But for some people, it can be really challenging because they may feel like they are in a good place with their recovery. And they may be a bit like, well, I'm recovered now. Do I still need to, have cake? Do I still need to join my family out for pizza? To which I will say, yes, these are normal behaviors. Food freedom is not just a thing that you do in recovery and then you're back to just eating your safe foods. But for some people, they may gradually slide into a default. They may feel like that was recovery. I'm done with that now. And there may be part of them that secretly wishes that that change is going to lead to weight loss. And don't get me wrong, sometimes recovery eating is going to look different than recovered eating. Some people in recovery, all they want is pizza and chocolate all day. But then once they're fully recovered, they may crave a variety of foods. That's fine. That's normal. It's more when you start completely excluding things and are like, well, I'm recovered now, so I'm done with this. Then I would say, are you really recovered? And then a situation I sometimes see here is someone where they are in a better place with their recovery. They may experience at this point that their appetite is down a little bit. They may not crave the quote unquote fun foods as strongly anymore. So it's quite easy to decline cake. They may also have started to exercise again. And they're noticing that, oh, this is really fun. I want to do it more. And they may get into a bit of a community where a lot of the focus is around toning up. And it seems like the people around them or the people on social media, they're going on a little cut phase and they're completely fine. So again, it doesn't always start with a wish to relapse. It's more sneaky little behaviors that get normalized to a point where it's hard to tell what is the eating disorder and what is not. And then a lot of times if people really give into that, what often happens is that it becomes more and more and more disordered. Whenever I hear of, for example, fitness influencers who are like, I used to have an eating disorder. I'm completely over that now. But then you see everything they post about is food and their body and their exercise, and they constantly losing and gaining weight, calling it a bulk and cut cycle. And you're a bit like, how much of your thoughts and behaviors and focus is still around food, body, and movement? Like, are you sure you're really free? But it's rationalized, it's normalized, it's often applauded by the people around them, by their audience. And because they're so clear that they're over this whole eating disorder thing now, they're unable to see that it may have actually just shape-shifted. This is especially common sometimes in people who've had quite a severe eating disorder, and now they still have, disordered eating, but it's not like it was before, right? They're like, oh, I used to be super skinny and I used to not eat things. Now I eat everything. It just has to be high protein. It just has to fit with my workouts. So this is another thing that can make people relapse, but also a thing that can make someone just not fully recover to begin with. The whole thing of replacing one obsession with food, exercise, and body with another. And this is, again, I think very often understated. People who think that, okay, I'm done with recovery, so now I will become a fitness athlete. I'll become a clean eating chef. I'll lose a bit of weight for my sport. Or just anything that isn't directly driven by the exact same obvious motivations that it once was, when maybe someone was more in like an anorexic type mindset. But then you start seeing the similarities. And some people may be like, oh yeah, but what's the harm? Well, the harm is that, first of all, it often is quite a stressful place to be in. But another harm is that a lot of times it puts you at a risk of falling back to that hardcore eating disorder mindset. It's the slippery slope effect, essentially. So another factor of relapse that is also often not spoken about is resuming to movement. And I want to be careful with how I talk about this, because I also don't want to excessively scare people away from going back to an activity that maybe they used to really enjoy in a non-eating disordered way. I sometimes feel there's a slight implication in some recovery spaces that, oh yeah, you can never exercise again. Exercise is inherently disordered. If someone exercises, it's because they want to lose weight. And I think in a way, this is kind of a way for the eating disorder to still be controlling you. I think if someone thinks that way, that maybe be an implication that their mindset hasn't completely healed. And yeah, I of course understand that there are a lot of people who, for example, go to the gym to lose weight. But I notice, at least for myself, when someone says, I'm going to go to the gym, my immediate thought isn't, oh, why are you trying to lose weight? Because for me, that is not what going to the gym means. But it also is so important not to then go in the other extreme of being like, I'm recovered now, so exercise can't be a problem. I don't want to let my eating disorder hold me back, so I'm going to just start doing it again with no guardrails. That is a huge relapse risk, guys. I think some of the issues with eating disorder treatment around this particular issue is that it often is a very yes-no mindset around movement. And the assessment is oftentimes made on physical indicators rather than mental one. So for example, someone is going to eating disorder treatment, they have a movement ban, and then as soon as they reach a certain weight, they're like, oh, you have the green light to do movement again now. But there's no like guardrails or no assessment if they're mentally ready for it. Not to mention that just because you reach a certain weight doesn't necessarily mean you're physically ready for it either. And what may have happened is that the person has a template for movements, whether it's conscious or subconscious, that oftentimes is quite eating disorder aligned. So if you just tell them, oh, you can go back to movement now, they start doing movement in the way that their eating disorder has set it. They're following the eating disorder script, essentially. Maybe they're like, oh, I'm going to start going for a walk. But their only like reference point of what a walk means going for a really intense, fast walk. It has to be at least X amount of minutes. You can't stop. You can't sit down. You have to check the time or the step count. Or maybe they're clear to go to the gym and they just go and do what they've always been doing in the gym. They go straight to the treadmill and they run until they burn a certain amount of calories. And then they go lift weight and they don't really take proper breaks. They just push through. Because they've worked on the food, but they haven't worked on really changing their approach to movement. And sometimes it's not even conscious. You're just following your old patterns. And when working with clients, we will often dedicate at least one full session just planning out potential guardrails, potential triggers, red flags, green flags, and set very specific agreements and like an actual plan on how to go ahead with the movement in a safe and gradual way. And then checking in and seeing, did something come up? Was it hard? Did you notice your eating disorder started creeping up? Were you able to resist some of the maybe urges that came up to walk a bit faster or further, to lift a bit more disordered and intense and ignore your body's limits? Or maybe you were like, wow, this was really fun, nice, and easy and smooth. You never really know until you try, but it's so important to try it with the right mindset, at the right time, and with the right support. And to maybe be okay with the fact that there may be certain types of movement that aren't for you anymore, or maybe aren't for you at this very time. Maybe a dance class is going to be better than a spinning class. Maybe a slow walk with a friend is going to be better than a solo walk. And sometimes you may have to lay seemingly quite strict and specific guidelines in the beginning. And then with time, as you're building a new script of what movement looks like for you, it becomes easier and more natural. And you don't have to be so strict with yourself. It's fine if you go for a long walk, but maybe you couldn't start there. And I actually find that when working with clients, resuming movement, in my experience, hasn't been like a massive factor for relapse if we are doing it in a collaborative way and if they're actually like following through on the agreements we've set. It seems actually to work out pretty well. Sometimes even better than the person expected. But when it's done with no guardrails, or if there's a part of you that kind of just brushes off the idea of having any kind of limitations or guardrails or tools and just like, I'm over this eating disorder, I'll just start running again. That can potentially be a risk. Not to say that it always is. Some people may just jump into an activity and feel completely fine after recovery, but for some people, it can be a trigger. And why is that? Well, sometimes it is the environment. Sometimes it is engaging in a behavior that your brain associates with the eating disorder. Sometimes it may be because you're ending up in a bit of a deficit. This is not always the case, and I do think people tend to really overestimate how much movement really impacts weight and calorie burn, and there's also some studies backing this up. But if you just suddenly start training for a marathon, there is oftentimes a rapid increase in energy needs that may be a bit hard logistically to fulfill. So another relapse factor that I want to mention, this may be a bit more like a slip factor. So not necessarily always something that causes a full relapse, but something I've spotted in a lot of clients that sets them back a little bit in recovery temporarily, but usually we're able to kind of get back on the horse. And that is physical illness. Having a flu or a stomach bug or anything that causes a temporary loss in appetite can sometimes set something off, even if you may feel like you mentally are in quite a good place. And this is one of those terrifying parts of recovery where you may have a stomach bug and your appetite is low, and you're noticing that because your appetite is low and you're not getting in enough food, certain thoughts come creeping back. And you may be a bit like, oh my God, I have no intention to relapse. I literally just have a bad tummy. Why am I suddenly getting these crazy eating disorder thoughts popping up? This means that I'm quite vulnerable. To which I will say, yes, for now, but this is probably not going to be how you respond to brief illness for the rest of your life. When you're in recovery or freshly out of recovery, you tend to be more vulnerable to a period, even if short, of an energetic deficit. Like the wiring, the eating disorder wiring is still quite fresh, so your brain may default to it pretty quick. I've experienced this myself. I remember in my recovery and also in, like, I would say like the year after my recovery, if I had, for example, like the flu or something like that and had appetite loss for whatever reason, it could really like make certain little thoughts kind of just creep up. And I was like, ooh, this is not me. I thought it was over this. But now for me, that's just not the case anymore. Nevertheless, I think it's very important that people are aware that this can happen. And please, if you're someone who's been recovered for a while, but you still notice these thoughts creeping up, don't just deny them because, oh, that's only something that happens in recovery or when someone is freshly recovered. What you're feeling and thinking is what you're feeling and thinking, completely irrelevant what I may be thinking and feeling. But I just want to share that it's a bit of a phenomena that I've observed. And I'm wondering if you guys can see a common theme emerging with some of these relapse factors that I mentioned. And I think to me, the big theme is ending up in either a deficit or in a pattern that the brain registers as a little bit too similar to the eating disorder, but without it being a very obvious trigger or a very commonly spoken about trigger. And oftentimes there being a slight element of denial or resistance towards being self-honest. And a lot of a mindset of, I'm over this, so I can't have these thoughts and feelings, even though you're having these thoughts and feelings. Last one that I want to mention that also really relates to what I just said is a very specific experience that I have also made an episode about, and that is appetite loss after all in. I'm not going to go too much in detail about it because I made a whole episode about it. So if this very specific experience applies to you, then check out appetite loss after all in. But essentially, if someone goes from having very high food drive and then have a reactive low food drive, maybe combined with the eating and recovery oftentimes not really being quite structured, then that can sometimes lead to unintentional undereating. Again, oftentimes not with the intention of relapsing. It just feels intuitive, it feels natural. You're waking up and you're not really hungry for breakfast anymore. And I mean, those snack foods aren't so fun anymore, so why have them? And it's a tricky one because yes, some people will notice a little bit of weight shifting, sometimes some overshot tapering off after all in. Typically there may be a lot of water retention and that may start kind of evening out, and appetite will often go down. You're not going to necessarily feel like eating 20,000 calories a day forever. But sometimes for some people, not everyone, some people, that drop can be quite significant. Sometimes a little bit too steep of a drop. And this kind of ties me into another factor of relapse, which is prematurely turning to intuitive eating in people who don't have extreme hunger. Very classical example here would be someone in anorexia recovery who are on a meal plan and they may be at a slightly healthier weight and they're like, oh, I don't need the meal plan anymore. I'm just going to eat intuitively. I'm just going to eat freely. But they may experience this phenomena that we see a lot in anorexia recovery, which is that the hormones that regulate weight and appetite, they kind of normalize a little bit too soon. So they may not be at their set point, but they start struggling to put on the last bit of weight that actually is essential for mental and physical recovery. And it may feel like they're just intuitively eating, and they may even be at a pretty good amount as well. If they have been doing recovery in a way where they have actually increased their intake, they may actually be on like a pretty solid amount of food, but the weight is just stalling at like maybe borderline underweight. I was exactly at this stage where I was on a pretty good meal plan. I was eating more than many people around me, and my weight was healthier, but not quite where my body needed to be. And I still was quite rigid. I clearly wasn't quite there, but my weight wasn't shifting despite me eating quite a lot. And it could have been so tempting to just be like, oh, well, that's clearly you being at your set point. That's clearly you being ready for intuitive eating. Just go for it. And thank God my treatment team was instead like, no, you actually have to increase your intake. We have to push up your weight because you are not there yet. This is not your body just reaching its set point. This is not your body telling you, oh, you don't need more food. It's you experiencing a very textbook response that we see oftentimes in anorexia recovery. It's not something everyone experiences, but it is common, especially for those who do a relatively high calorie meal plan from the get-go. And again, this can also happen sometimes with all in. And then you may have to turn to some degree of mechanical eating, and that's fine. And if someone ends up stuck in a phase of not being at their set point weight and not actually eating the amount that their body needs, even if the amount of food that their body needs feels really wrong, then that can be a massive relapse factor. I mean, first of all, you're not going to be fully recovered in that place, but also you're so vulnerable to falling backwards. Sometimes the eating disorder part of someone's brain may be like, oh my God, this seems like paradise. I can eat a lot of food and not starve myself and still stay skinny, woohoo. And that's just not how it works. It's a bit of a limit to how long you can actually stay in that in-between space. At some point, your body will start knowing what's up. And if not, I mean, your brain is not going to be fully recovered. Like, did you start recovery just to be in perpetual recovery? That's a shitty deal. And my God, it's a very expensive deal as well. Like, actual proper high quality eating disorder support is going to be an investment. No shame in needing long-term support, by the way. I often work with people over a prolonged period of time. But I think it is important to remind people of the reality of being stuck in perpetual recovery. And there's a difference between needing support over a longer period of time versus being stuck or holding yourself back by just staying in that quasi-recovery comfort zone. And is it that comfortable if both your eating disorder and your healthy self are pissed off at you at the same time? And that takes me to the biggest predictor of relapse, which is not fully recovering. And of course, it's better to be in a better place than in the depth of your eating disorder. I don't want to encourage that black and white thinking of, oh my God, I can't imagine myself being fully recovered, so I'm not even going to make any recovery changes. But even though it's completely possible to relapse after being 100% recovered, the biggest factor I see is someone who is still in quasi-recovery. Maybe they know, maybe they don't. A lot of times people are a little bit in denial. A lot of times people are in the mindset of, oh yeah, I'll not completely recover, but I'll manage the eating disorder to a point where it's not completely controlling my life. I'll still watch my food quite strictly. I'll still engage in disordered movement. I'll still suppress my weight a bit, but it's not going to be as bad as it was. And the thing with an eating disorder is, like I said, it's such a slippery slope. And of course, staying in this state is not really freedom. But even if you could stay in this state, it makes you incredibly vulnerable for relapse. The absolutely best thing you can do in order to minimize your chance of relapsing is not to never go through anything in life that may be triggering or difficult. It's not to never move or never have a breakup or never lose someone you care about. Those experiences are part of life. It's what makes us human, right? I don't think a life of complete avoidance of pain and friction and conflict is realistic or even healthy. But what's so important is knowing when you're vulnerable, knowing your potential signs that something is not quite right, that things are going in the wrong direction, having the right support, professional, or even just in your life in general, and building healthy coping mechanisms that don't rely on restriction, over-exercise, or changing your body. Because so many times people start attacking their body for something that has nothing to do with their body. Oh, you got rejected, you had a bad day. Well, change your body, fix your body, and then everything will be fine. It's like a lazy shortcut in the brain that prevents the brain from dealing with what's actually going on. And even though eating disorders suck, I think it's important to be honest with yourself of what you're getting from it. Is there a sense of validation, of comfort, of concern, of identity? And what if those are healthy needs, and what if those are needs that maybe aren't so healthy? And how can you fulfill some of those things in a healthier way? For example, we all have a need to be seen by other people. But if you have an excessive need to be seen by other people, that may be worth addressing. And if you have more of like a natural, normal need to be seen by other people, can you achieve that in different ways? And it's so important to really commit to not turning to the eating disorder as a comfort blanket, as a way of coping with life. Because you're not coping, you're avoiding. You're creating another problem to fix another problem, right? Your eating disorder doesn't make those difficult things in life go away. It just gives you a distraction to focus on. And that may feel in the moment like it's working, but it's not really. And a lot of times people don't realize this until they are recovered, and then life happens again. They suddenly have to face things. And this can be really scary and sometimes even make relapse seem like a tempting out. But is that what you are on this precious planet for? Are your life meant to be avoided forever? And even though an eating disorder can feel like it helps regulate emotions short term, if you look more at like a long-term basis, it tends to make people more emotionally dysregulated rather than actually regulated. Because you're not learning healthier coping skills. You're not learning healthier ways of managing your emotions. So it's important to look at some of the underlying things that made you more vulnerable to develop an eating disorder to begin with. And look for the moment when an eating disorder starts feeling like a real tempting option. And if you're noticing signs of relapse, be honest with yourself, with the people around you, with your treatment team, and take action quicker. Don't wait until it gets worse, because this is a massive mistake I see people make. They're like, oh yeah, I'm kind of sliding backwards, but my weight's not that bad yet. I'm not restricting that aggressively yet. And it's a bit like, oh, well, I have a cavity in my tooth, but it's not that bad. It doesn't hurt yet. And then you end up with a way more drastic and expensive emergency surgery, rather if you just attended to it to begin with. So don't fall into the not sick enough yet trap. The time when you're the most vulnerable to relapse, statistically speaking, would be in the months and also the year or so after recovery. Of course, you can relapse after that, but we see that the highest rates of relapse are typically, I think it's the 3 to 6 months after recovery where we see the relapse rates are the highest, and then it starts going down. So this may be a time where you have to be a bit extra mindful, again, not hypervigilant. Definitely don't hold yourself back from living your life because you are post-recovery. I sometimes see people wrapping themselves and their recovery into bubble wrap, but that in itself can also be a relapse trigger, because then you don't have anything else. Like you're limiting yourself from new connections and opportunities and meaning and purpose outside of your eating disorder and your recovery, which of course is going to make it a more tempting thing to go back. So you have a project to focus on again. So live your life, but it's fine if certain things you think could be a massive trigger are things maybe you wait a little bit with. Maybe not straight into training for a marathon when you're fresh out of recovery, for example. And know your tendency a bit here. If you are someone who tends to be like, tick, 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 I'm done with this, and I'm going to do this, then we may have to slow yourself down a bit. Whilst if you're a bit more the other direction, where you tend to maybe hold yourself back a bit, be really hypervigilant and stressed out about, oh my God, am I going to relapse? Am I going to relapse? And analyzing everything, then maybe actually for you, it could be good to push yourself a little bit. But you want to know yourself and your blind spots. And this is again often why going to a therapist or coach could be helpful, because sometimes you do not see these patterns in yourself. It's funny because I am in training to become a registered therapist in the UK, and part of my education requires me to be in therapy. And I was kind of like, what am I doing here? Like, I'm so self-aware. It's embarrassing to say it, but that was a little bit my mindset. I was a little bit arrogant. And I think I thought I was self-aware because I think a lot. But that is not necessarily self-awareness. If anything, I sometimes find that the people who spend the most time in their heads are often the least self-aware in certain arenas. So yeah, through my own therapy and through my own training, I realized that, oh, I also do have blind spots. Surprise, surprise. And I think the key is being able to explore that in an environment where you don't feel judged and where you feel safe. So yeah, I think a dose of healthy self-awareness without self-obsession can be incredibly helpful to prevent relapse. And maybe there are some parts of your brain that you don't explore that much because you don't want to go there. It's uncomfortable. It's quite confronting. But those may be the places where you really need to go. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode. And yeah, like I mentioned, if you want more, then head over to letsrecover.substack.com. And yeah, follow this podcast and tune in. I do try to post episodes quite regularly. I shoot for every 2 weeks, but occasionally it will be like 3 weeks or even 4 weeks if I have a lot going on. But I think I've been relatively consistent, mostly, maybe not this specific month, but usually. And for one-on-one coaching, head over to letsrecover.co.uk. I'm doing another round of intakes over the summer because I am now officially on holiday from my course, which means that I'll be able to take on a bit more clients, which I'm really looking forward to. If you've been on my waitlist for a while and haven't heard from me, please check your junk email. And if there's nothing there, do drop me an email at contact@letsrecover.co.uk, as I've had some weird issues with my emails just disappearing and going into junk. But yeah, I do still have a bit of a waitlist for coaching. I do try to get people in as quickly as I can. But it also depends a bit on your availability and time zones, that whole jam. All right, everyone. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.